I'm Chris Grayson, first off, thank you to Clark for inviting me and Thomas for organizing this today. My background is in digital advertising, but what I'm probably more known for within my profession is organizing events and speaking at industry events. Most recently, I organized an event here in New York, TEDx Silicon Alley. It was held in December, on December 3rd at Terminal 5. For those who may or may not be familiar, Ray Kurzweil and Juan Enriquez headlined at that event. And it's another event coming up on June 4th and 5th. It's Augmented World Expo. I organized this with a couple of other people, Ori Enbar and Tish Shute. And that will be coming up in the spring in Santa Clara, California. Now, normally when I'm invited to speak, I'm usually invited to speak about augmented reality, very often mobile augmented reality, and as of late, kind of a specific space, face recognition and face tracking in the out-of-home space. So when I was invited to speak today on anonymity and privacy in the public space, it was sort of a different perspective because I'm usually speaking to people in in industry and in marketing and advertising about how technologies are going to affect their industry, and this is sort of a different perspective. So I had to sort of think some about, well, where would I start from speaking on that subject, and the thing that kept returning to mind was the panopticon. Is anyone here familiar with the panopticon? Yes, absolutely. So Jeremy Bentham, British social theorist, in the 1790s, came up with this theory for a prison design built in the round, and with the guard tower in the center. Now, very few were actually built. This is actually the ruins of a prison in Cuba. It's one of the only prisons that was actually built upon the concept of the panopticon. But because of the station of the guard tower in the center and all the prison cells being around the circumference, any prisoner could be observed at any time and never know whether they were being observed or not being observed. So they were in a state of presumed constant surveillance. And this led me to kind of start thinking about a project that happened back in the 90s. Back in the mid-90s, there was kind of a growing concern here in New York that security cameras were proliferating throughout the city. And the New York Civil Liberties Union got together with the community boards in the city, and they canvassed all of New York. They had volunteers go out block by block and note where every security camera was, because there was no database of this. There were cameras watching that were from the federal government, state government, city government, the police department. There were also broadcast stations that had cameras watching different intersections for weather reports, and small business owners with security cameras in front of their stores. And there was no documentation of where all of these cameras were. And so they did this project, and they completed it in '98. And a group called the Institute for Applied Autonomy launched this project based upon those studies. And what they did was you would go to this website and you would enter your point of departure and your point of arrival, and then it would pathfind through Manhattan your path of least surveillance. Now, there wasn't really anywhere you could go within Manhattan that you weren't observed somewhere by some camera, but it would give you the path where you were observed by 10 or 15 cameras as opposed to 200. The problem with this project, as clever as it was that it launched in October of 2001. So it was a month after September 11th, and suddenly the climate in the city, the mental climate of the perception of the populace was no longer so concerned about their privacy. Suddenly, security concerns had sort of become preeminent. But if we are concerned here in New York about, being surveilled, we really have nothing on London. London is the most highly surveilled city in the world. There are just in their train system alone, there are over 11,000 cameras, and if that weren't enough, throughout the city there are almost 500,000. So the Lower Manhattan Security Initiative, where Bloomberg has over the past year been installing 3,000 new security cameras around the World Trade Center, is actually pretty small prize by comparison. But I think what's probably more alarming isn't so much the proliferation of the cameras themselves, the technology that can now be employed. This is Anonymity software that maps for facial recognition from cameras. This is software that's marketed to police and security services. I'm going to pivot here some from the public to the private space. A couple of years ago, Facebook launched a feature called Tag Suggestion. And when you would go to tag a friend in a photo, and you may have noticed this feature before, it used to be you had to go in and type in the name. A couple of years ago, suddenly it would identify a face and it would recommend who Facebook thought the person was. Well, for years, when you were uploading and labeling and tagging all of your friends' faces, what Facebook didn't tell you was that they were in the process of building the largest face recognition database in the world. And they used your tagging to build it. And there was a bit of privacy concern, sort of uproar when it first launched. And in September of last year, they kind of butted heads with the EU and agreed to take down that feature in the EU. And when they did, they took it down everywhere. It's still down in the EU, but as of the 1st of this month, 1st of February, they have brought that feature back in the US. So, a little ahead of myself here. So, Facebook isn't the only one that plays in this space. I imagine people here are probably familiar with Google Goggles. Okay. One interesting sort of non-feature in Google Goggles, may be aware, it will not identify people. But it's not because it can't. It's not because the technology can't. It's because they've actually disabled that ability. If you go into Google image search, they've added a feature. It used to be an undocumented beta feature where if you did a search string, you could put this on the end of your URL, &IMG by people's face, and it would only return faces. They've recently actually made that part of the advanced search feature. You can just select face, and it will only return results for faces. Now, if you go into Google image search and you search for yourself and you come up, your face comes up being identified with your name, that means that in theory, the technology in Google Goggles would be able to identify you. But what the Google Goggles team did was when you take a picture with Google Goggles, it actually does a face tracking algorithm, looks to find a face. If it sees the picture is an image of a face, it disables the ability to identify it. And the Google Goggles team actually said that was one of the most difficult features they had to incorporate into the application, was the ability not to tell you who somebody's face was, because they were so concerned about the privacy issues involved. I'll skip on. This is Eric Schmidt talking about facial recognition and how Google is sort of holding certain technologies back. So all the big players are in this space, obviously. This is Apple's facial recognition, where technologies that were originally developed for the military use in the space of just a couple of decades are now being used by grandparents to identify their grandchildren in their family photo albums. So at Mobile World Congress a couple of years ago, there were these two applications that were demoed, got a lot of attention, and then just sort of vanished. Converse partnered with Face.com based on Israeli military technology. They would identify a face in a mobile app, tell them who it was. And another team, the Astonishing Tribe and Polar Rose, had an application that did the very same thing, except it would also identify if you put yourself into the database with certain social media applications. If somebody pointed at you, it would tell you what their social media apps are. I'm just going to kind of keep moving along. Then there's another company called Digital that demoed something very similar at CES. Something unique to theirs is that it could handle a very large database held locally on the device, so it wouldn't have to query the cloud, and the recognition would be almost instantaneous if the face was in the local database. Now, what's interesting about these companies is that over the past 18 months, first Qualcomm took a stake in Digital. They relocated from the Ukraine to Silicon Valley, and then they were acquired by Google. Face.com had a large investment from Yandex, the Russian equivalent of Google, before being acquired by Facebook. And then Polar Rose was acquired by Apple. All of these, and yet, none of those companies have yet productized that technology into a mobile consumer app, although the capability exists and has been demoed for a couple of years now. Moving still out in the public space, but out of mobile devices into digital out-of-home display, a French company called Quivity launched an application that really revolutionized analytics in the digital out-of-home display space. I had a demo of this a company called Échangeur in Paris year before last, and what it does is, as pedestrians are walking by, it used to be if you wanted media, if you wanted media metrics on what the value of a media buy was for an out-of-home display, you would have certain demographic information about the type of people that lived in a certain neighborhood and type of companies that were there, and you would know, like, this is approximately pedestrian foot traffic, and if it's near roadways, this is how many cars, and they would build a profile of who the viewer of that ad would be, and that's what you would base the price of the advertising on. But what Quivity did was it used facial recognition technology on a camera facing out from the display, and it could use facial recognition technology to tell when people looked up at the screen, would identify them, could identify gender with 90% accuracy, age to within 10 years, and length of engagement by the amount of time they looked at the ad, and could give a real-time video feed labeling women and men as they walked by looking at it that the advertiser could view in real time through their analytics dashboard, and suddenly you had accurate, up-to-the-minute analytics of who the demographics were, something that nobody had ever been able to do before. And it immediately became a very crowded space. It's only a couple of players, but I could put a dozen of these up here. Cognivision was a Canadian company that was more recently acquired by Intel. True Media, one that's particularly interesting, Seeing Machines out of Australia, one of the things they have is facial feature tracking, and it uses a high frame rate, and it can tell expressions. So if you're running their software, you can tell not only all of these things about gender and age and length of engagement, but you can tell what kind of reaction a user had. Did your advertisement cause happiness? Did it make people upset? Were they shocked? And these sort of things can feed into the analytics. Now, there's another player that's here locally, Immersive Labs. They relocated to New York from Boulder, Colorado a couple of years ago. A fellow named Jason Sosa founded this company, and what they do is, in addition to all of those other things, they also they have a content management system that's built into it, but they actually take a picture of everyone that looks at the ad, and they retain that image in a database. But it's anonymous. They serial it, and they know whether the same person has come back and viewed the ad again or viewed the ad on another display somewhere else. But it's kept as an anonymous face database. And that's the way they're addressing the privacy concern over people that are recognized. Now, there's another art project that was done here in the city, and this is basically camouflage for facial recognition software. They used OpenCV, and they used its algorithm to identify a face, and then tried different combinations of makeup and haircuts and whatnot to be able to confuse, in this case the project is called Dazzle, to be able to dazzle the face recognition algorithm and make it not be able to identify the person as a face. And where I think this really leads us is to the fact that the genie is out of the bottle. I don't think we're never going to be at a point where this software is not going to be tracking you in the public sphere, whether it's from a private company or the state. That's just the new reality. And unless you want to be in a sort of arms race of camouflage with algorithms, which sounds like a losing battle to me, and probably also not very fashionable. What I believe the only real solution for the individual, if you will, is to make all of the information that state actors and private sector actors have at their disposal available as much as possible to the individual as well. And one of the things that I believe is going to be taking place, probably, well, very soon, some of it's happening now, but will eventually become commonplace, is that the interface for a mobile device is going to move from this thing you carry into your pocket into something that's directly communicating to your eye. Now, there are a variety of reasons, why this is more reasonable. Everyone has seen somebody that's walked into a telephone pole. People walking down the street texting. This is not a user interface that's appropriate for being a pedestrian and being safe. This is an interface that's been adapted from the desktop into a small screen, and it's a keyhole interface, to this computer system. And when this particular device is a joint venture between Kopin and Motorola Solutions, it's used in industry, and I imagine most people here are probably familiar with Google Glass. And it is supposed to be released as a consumer product by end of year this year. And I think that that's the direction that most mobile interfaces will be going. So this is actually for anybody that has an interest in Augmented World Expo.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.